In this chapter, we will be dealing with Chapter 3 of the prescribed textbook, Supporting Processors and Upgrading Memory. We will be comparing the characteristics and features of Intel and AMD processors used for personal computers, selecting, installing, and upgrading a processor, comparing the different kinds of physical memory and how they work, and lastly, learn about upgrading memory. The first learning outcome deals with comparing the characteristics and features of Intel and AMD processors used for personal computers. We now look at the characteristics of processors in general. Every CPU has a processor frequency or the speed at which it can operate. And this speed is measured in gigahertz. Also, a processor can be characterized at a specific lithography, which is the average space between transistors printed on the surface of the silicon chip. A processor has a specific socket and chipset that it can use. There are Intel's sockets and chipset and AMD's sockets and chipsets. A processor can have an ability to do more than one task at a time, and this is called multiprocessing. When Windows hands off a task to the CPU, this is called a thread. The ability of a processor to handle more than one thread is called multi-threading. Intel calls this hyper-threading and AMD calls it hypertransport. A server might have two processor sockets, and this is called dual processor. There are a number of caches that you can find on a processor. These caches dramatically increase the amount of throughput we can get into one of these processors. It's a very fast memory, and it's designed to increase how much information we're able to get into the processor and out of the processor. Usually there is level 1, level 2, and level 3 cache. A processor might support dynamic random access memory, known as DRAM, such as DDR2, DDR3, or DDR4. Also, a CPU can support virtualization. A processor might have the ability to manipulate graphics data to form the images on a monitor screen. And lastly, a processor can run at a higher frequency than recommended by the processor manufacturer, and this is called overclocking. Hybrid processors can process 32-bit or 64-bit, and servers can use fully implemented 64-bit processing, including the Itanium and Xeon processors. Hybrid processors can process 32-bit or 64-bit, and servers can use fully implemented 64-bit processing, including the Itanium and Xeon processors. A video processing portion of the computer made up of the parts that put a changing image on the monitor traditionally has a discrete microprocessor that differs in both function and architecture from the CPUs designed for general-purpose computing. The generic term for the video processor is a graphic processing unit, known as GPU. Graphics processors can handle certain tasks much more efficiently than the standard CPU. Integrating a GPU into the CPU enhances the overall performance of the computer while at the same time reducing energy use, size, and cost. Both Intel and AMD produce CPUs with integrated GPUs. For many years, the quality of the GPU performance with the demanding graphical programs like games made the choice between the two easy. Intel Corporation thoroughly dominated the personal computer market with its CPUs and motherboard support chips. At nearly every step in the evolution of the PC, Intel has led the way with technological advances and surprising flexibility for such a huge corporation. Intel CPUs, and more specifically, their instruction sets, define the personal computer. Intel currently produces a dozen or so models of CPU for both desktop and portable computers. Most of Intel's desktop and laptop processors are sold under the Core, Pentium, and Celeron brands. They are very low power portable smartphone chips are branded Atom. Their high-end server chips are called Xeon. The Intel Core processors first introduced in the second generation are as follows. The Core i9 and Core i7, which are made for high-end desktops and laptops. Core i5 is well suited for mainstream desktops and laptops. Core i3 is an entry-level processor for desktops and laptops. Pentium processors are designed for entry-level desktops and laptops. Atom is made for low-end desktops, netbooks, and laptops. And the Celeron is made for low-end netbooks and laptops. Advanced micro devices processors are popular in the game and hobbyist markets and are generally less expensive than comparable Intel processors. Their processor families include the Ryzen Pro, Ryzen Threadripper for the desktop computers. For laptops, their families include Ryzen Pro, A-Series, and A-Series Pro. And for servers, the EPYC and Opteron. The second learning outcome deals with selecting, installing, and upgrading a processor. As a technician, you need to know how to install the processor on the motherboard for each of the current Intel and AMD sockets used for desktop and laptop computers. In this learning outcome, we are focusing on the key thing you need to consider or think of when selecting a processor. It's important to look at how much performance this CPU can offer, understand if this processor can be able to multitask. You need to balance the performance and power of the CPU with that of the whole system. Also, check what others are commenting about the CPU you are considering to purchase. In this part of the learning outcome, we look at the practical steps you need to follow to install an Intel processor. When installing a CPU, you need to exercise caution not to bend any of the tiny pins. The location of the pin differs between Intel and AMD. With Intel-based motherboards, the sockets have hundreds of tiny pins that line up with the contacts on the bottom of the CPU. Intel CPUs use a LAN grid array package for socketed CPUs, where the underside of the CPU has hundreds of contact points that line up with the socket pins. We now look at the general procedure for installation of an Intel processor. You should use an ESD strap or anti-static glove to protect the processor, motherboard, and other components against the ESD. Power down the system, unplug the power cord, press the power button to drain the system of power and open the case. For a new motherboard, look for a protective cover over the processor socket. Remove this socket cover and keep it in a safe place. If you ever remove the processor, put the cover back on the socket to protect it. While the socket is exposed, be very careful not to touch the pins in the socket. As you lift the lever, the socket load plate is raised. Notice the two posts on either side of the socket next to the hinge. Open the clear plastic protective cover around the processor and locate the two notches and one gold triangle that helps you orient the processor in the socket. Hold the processor with your index finger and thumb and orient the processor so that the two notches on its edge line up with the post embedded on the socket. Check carefully to make sure the processor is aligned correctly in the socket. Push down on the lever and gently return it to its locked position. In this part of the learning outcome, we look at the practical steps you need to follow to install an Intel cooler assembly. CPUs don't tolerate heat well, and modern processors need active cooling solutions just to function at all. Almost every CPU uses a combination of a heatsink and a fan assembly to wick heat away from the CPU. The steps for installing a cooler assembly include examining the cooler posts that fit over the Intel socket, 4 holes and the clips, nuts, bolts, screws, or plates that will hold the cooler firmly in place. If the cooler has thermal compound pre-applied, remove the plastic from the compound. Some heavy coolers provide a plate that fits underneath the motherboard with nuts, bolts, and screws to secure it to the board. Install the plate. After the plate is installed, install the cooler on top of the processor. For lighter coolers with locking pins, verify that the locking pins are turned as far as they will go in a counterclockwise direction. The fan on a cooler receives its power from a 4-pin CPU fan header on the motherboard. Connect the power cord from the cooler fan to this 4-pin header. In this part of the learning outcome, we look at the practical steps you need to follow to install an AMD processor and cooler assembly. To install an AMD processor, do as follows. Open the socket lever, holding the processor very carefully so you don't touch the bottom. Orient the 4 empty pin positions on the bottom with the 4 filled hole positions in the socket. Check carefully to make sure the pins in the processor are sitting slightly in the holes. Press the lever down and gently into position. You are now ready to apply the thermal compound and install the cooler assembly. Next, clip the clipping mechanism into place on one side of the cooler. Connect the power cord from the fan to the 4-pin CPU fan header on the motherboard next to the processor.